Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, how far will the U.S. let Israel go?
One of the largest attacks on Beirut in decades began as dusk fell over the city and continued long into the night.
The inner workings of the U.S.'s entanglement in another Middle East war. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Events are moving quickly as the regional war that everyone feared encroaches.
In Tel Aviv, the sound of sirens reverberated throughout the city, and explosions lit up the night skies overhead.
There were reports of the first face-to-face fighting going on. Hezbollah say they pushed those Israeli forces back.
The United States has promised that it's standing by Israel and has over and over reiterated that it supports Israel's right to defend itself.
Israel has the right to defend itself.
We have said from the very beginning, Israel has a right to defend itself.
We have been clear that we support Israel's right to self-defense.
Now, that defense includes sending an estimated additional 3,000 troops on top of the 40,000 U.S. troops already stationed in the Middle East, plus aircraft carriers, a nuclear-powered submarine, fighter jet squadrons, and a variety of other military equipment. My guest today is taking us behind the decisions that led us here.
I'm Akbar Shahid Ahmed. I'm the senior diplomatic correspondent at HuffPost, and I'm writing a book on the Biden administration and the war in Gaza.
Akbar, it's really good to have you back on The Take. Anyone who follows you on the social media platform X knows that one of the things that you are best at is offering these behind-the-scenes admissions from government officials and from diplomats about policies that sometimes have the rest of us completely taken aback. So that's what I want to talk about today. In one of your latest articles for HuffPost, you share an exchange with an unnamed U.S. government official about the word limited, and this shows up on your X account as well. That word has been used when it comes to Israel's current military actions. In response, they said, everyone who says it's going to be limited is a white man who thinks 1 million dead brown people is limited. So, Akbar, how does the Biden administration define limited, or are they showing that there are no limits?
I think what that quote gets to so powerfully is that the playbook the Biden administration is relying on has increasingly been tinged with this kind of almost colonial view of the Middle East, right? This sense of who is a full person, who is not. So can you define as limited a military campaign, for instance, in Rafah, that displaced more than 1 million people, which the Biden administration did do. They said, oh, look, the Israelis did a limited campaign in Rafah instead of what we said. I think there's such a deep frustration inside government as to how this word is being used, what the highest levels of the administration, particularly at the White House, and frankly, particularly the president and the 3 white men who are the most influential in this policy, which is Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, and Tony Blinken. What they say is Israel can go into southern Lebanon, which is what they're doing. They can continue to run counter-terror raids in Gaza, and we won't see a huge death toll. We won't see hundreds of casualties. That said, Malika, we're seeing scores, right? We're seeing 70, 80, 60, 50 people per different airstrikes. So for a lot of observers, including inside the government, there's a huge frustration at what feels Orwellian and what feels like a distortion of the obvious reality. And you and I are looking at, images, video from the ground. People inside government have access to intelligence, right? They have a much better sense than we do. And that intelligence is telling them there is no way this is going to be a limited situation.
The last time we had you on the podcast, we took a deep dive behind the curtain to talk about some of those 3 white men that you mentioned. For those who missed that episode or the uninitiated, what should we know about McGurk, Sullivan, and Blinken?
Let's start with Brett McGurk, because I think he's the one who's a bit of a mystery to people, although there seems to be increasing awareness. Brett McGurk is what one DC insider described to me as akin to a cockroach, right? I mean, this is someone who has been running Middle East policy from the Bush era, through Obama, through Trump, and now under Biden. McGurk's defenders would say, look, that shows he has a lot of experience and he knows all the players, so he's taken seriously. There's a real concern that he's fundamentally shaped by being in Iraq after the US invasion in 2003, having this kind of overweening view of the role the US can play and not taking into account how much local communities can shape the situation, right? Whether that's Palestinians, whether that's Iraqis, whether that's Kurds, in any context. And he's extremely close to the president. His view on Israel-Palestine has very much been, let's kick the can down the road on an Israeli-Palestinian settlement, but let's prioritize an Israel-Saudi deal. And that continues to be his overarching view, is let's get America's friends in the region to be closer. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the other Arab states like the UAE and Bahrain, who have already kind of formed relations with Israel, let's align them all. However, what Palestinians and many of his critics say is that is so reductive of the region, right? I mean, it's not considering how do people in those countries want to be aligned with Israel in this moment? And fundamentally, is that a sustainable alliance? Sullivan and Blinken have a similarity in that they are both consummate staffers. They've never been elected by anyone. They've never kind of been in this big position by themselves, but they've always served someone like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. And I think that really shapes their worldview, and that they're not doing a lot of pushback with the president. They don't have that heft.
And so much of that really shows up. So, as you mentioned, you're writing a book about the Biden administration's handling of Israel's war on Gaza over this past year. And in your reporting, you've received access to a lot of rooms and a lot of people that our audiences might never have access to. What are those conversations that you're having with people? What are they sounding like?
I think it's evolved over the course of this year-long war. You know, there was initially just so much revulsion at what the US was implicated in, right? And you saw that come up in resignations of government officials, protests from them, and also internally at the State Department, where staffers were crying. You know, personnel were screaming at their bosses, and their bosses didn't have good answers for them other than, maybe you should work on another issue set. You know, it's really, this has caused a rift inside the administration, unlike anything seen in the Biden presidency. And according to many of my sources, my more experienced sources, unlike anything they've seen in foreign policy circles since 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. But now, Malika, I think there's a new wave of just impatience and just unbelievable frustration. I think you will see that bubble up in the weeks and months ahead as Israel's offensive in Lebanon expands, because the sense is, we've been complaining, we've used internal channels, we've used external channels. You chose not to listen to us on Gaza, fine. But for a lot of these government servants, they cannot stomach the idea of a second front when it's so clear what might happen and what the Israeli operating procedures are. And then finally, a third possible front, right? If this becomes a huge regional war, if, as many hawks in Israel and in the US would like, if this becomes a confrontation between the US and Iran, right, which is the biggest risk here.
So let's talk a little bit more about that tug of war there. From what you're telling me, there are some calls, and have been for a while, calls within the government to change course. One of those courses is withholding military assistance to Israel. The U.S. has done it before, several times, in fact. What or who is stopping the administration from changing course this time, whether it's withholding funds or other measures?
The president. I mean, it really does go back to the president. I think his conception of himself is that, again, based on people who know him well, his conception of himself is that he cannot go down in history as a president who denied Israel any kind of assistance at a moment of need, because he perceives himself as such a strong supporter of Israel. There are many, many supporters of Israel, and in fact, many Israelis who would say the most helpful thing you could do for Israel's long-term future would be to try to get it out of this quagmire, right? And use whatever leverage and influence you have, whether that's withholding weapons, whether that's withholding funding. I've talked to several current and former Israeli officials who've described how they're kind of waiting for a phone call from Washington. and has been for months, right? They're just hoping for that.
A phone call that says, stop, you've gone too far. This is no longer limited, any of those things.
Precisely. And what that also tells us from their system is it's clear that would work, right? It's clear that if that were to happen, that would create a different level of pressure on Netanyahu. And it's important to remember that what I keep going back to, Malika, this administration knew exactly who it was dealing with, right? They were not babes in the wood trying to see, is Benjamin Netanyahu interested in peace, or is he interested in pummeling Palestinians or in escalating with Iran? They knew well what he was, and they communicated that to the press. I was with senior administration officials the night before they revealed that Lebanon ceasefire deal, and they seemed so confident, thinking, we're going to get a settlement here. We really think we have it. And the way the Israelis not just showed them, there is no bargain, but did the most escalatory thing they could possibly do, killing the leader of Hezbollah. Right after that, I mean, that's a kick in the teeth.
On U.S. soil.
Right. And ordering that operation from U.S. soil, I think, and 2 or 3 days later, to hear some of those same officials push the talking point of, now the Israelis are going to listen to us and be limited in Lebanon. I mean, it's another level of dissonance that I think is really, I'm still processing.
More with Akbar after the break. So, Akbar, clearly, the U.S. is entangled in what is now heading towards a full-on regional war.
Israel's air defenses intercepting some of the almost 200 ballistic missiles launched by Iran toward the country.
Israel has begun its ground offensive into the south.
We're getting reports there's been a major security incident involving Israeli soldiers on the border with Lebanon.
It's the first face-to-face incident since the launch of the ground operation.
The regional war that Biden, from the very beginning, warned against and said he did not want. How much military intervention do you think the U.S. is actually willing to give at this stage?
I think a decision hasn't been made inside the administration. I think what we do see, the hints we do see, I'd break down into 2 categories. One is the tangible and one is the rhetorical. The tangible is there are already 40,000 U.S. troops in the region, and they are sending an additional several thousand. We know that includes fighter jet squadrons. We know that has included a strike group from an aircraft carrier. So the build-up is there. The forces are there. And what that means as those folks are arrayed there is not just if there's something intentional, but if there is something unintentional, right? If one strike from Israel, from Iran, from an Iran-linked group goes somewhere that's emotional or that has some strategic impact, like an oil refinery, very quickly things could escalate into a shooting war. And I think that's the place people didn't want to be. And just rhetorically, I think you saw it in the vice presidential debate. The administration is also looking at the mood. The mood in the circles the administration is paying attention to is escalatory. You saw in that, literally the debate moderators, their question to vice presidential candidates was not, how will you reduce tensions? It was, will you bomb Iran? Right? I mean, that was so telling in itself. You've seen dozens of Republican lawmakers come out and say it's time for more escalation, and you haven't seen a huge Democratic call to de-escalate. Meanwhile, polls show us the American public are increasingly saying, we're worried about regional war. We want to see the U.S. play a diplomatic role, not a military role. But what we know from this administration is that it pays a lot more attention to opinion columnists in the New York Times, Morning Joe, a show that the president watches religiously, than it necessarily does to the general public.
Wow. I'm really glad you elucidated that and brought up what the public wants, because so much of our current state of affairs is about silos. And so in my silo, on my X feed and Instagram and all my other feeds, watching that debate, everyone was upset. Everyone said, how could you start with a question about preemptive war instead of how to de-escalate? But you're saying that doesn't really seem to be part of the calculus when it comes to an election in which the people vote, because the people that the administration is listening to are all about escalation. Am I hearing that right?
Well, I think they would frame it as deterrence, right? What I can say is that deterrence is really often used as a cover word in Washington, right, for military buildups that inevitably lead to escalation. Just because you have so many troops there, when you have, a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is the idea. And to your point about who the administration is listening to, they made a really clear decision, Malika, to not engage ultimately with the really strong anti-war movement that we've seen among young people, students, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, many Jewish Americans. The administration made a decision, the administration and the campaign, which I'd see in on this issue that's really working in lockstep, that they don't really want to cater to the anti-war group as much as they are paranoid about losing the pro-Israel group. And I think the fact that the statements you had coming out of Washington were very much not just, Israel took out Nasrallah and took out Haniyeh before him in Tehran, and Iran responded, let's finish it now. The statements were, Israel has been attacked by Iran. Look how successful we were in minimizing the consequences of that attack, because there was only one casualty. And we're going to punch back.
We have made clear that there will be consequences, severe consequences for this attack, and we will work with Israel to make that the case.
The attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military.
In terms of what Israel's response will be, of course, there must be consequences for Iran for this attack. We've made clear that there must be consequences.
So it was a yes and, which I think is really telling.
Audible sigh from me as I'm watching this and as you're watching this. Akbar, the Harris Walls campaign has given no indication that they're going to change tack from the Biden administration on what they're doing in the Middle East, which doesn't seem like a winning strategy to those who are watching that anti-war movement. What with the nickname that many of those protesters have given President Biden, Genocide Joe. And online, you have some people who are noting that Michigan, a key battleground state in this upcoming election, has more Lebanese Americans than Palestinian Americans, voters who typically tend to vote Democratic. What is the legacy that the Democrats are building for themselves here?
You'd have to ask them, but no, I will say, it's clear the party and the campaign are telling themselves a story. And I know this from talking to campaign officials and various other sources. The party and campaign are telling themselves, we gave the anti-war movement so much. We have met with them. We have not condemned them. And that's kind of it. But the anti-war movement is saying, it's so interesting, Malika, because it really, in a way, echoes the way the administration dealt with internal dissent, right, over the policy. The internal critics said, look, based on our subject matter knowledge, we are telling you, please do not take us and implicate us in this campaign, which looks like it's going to be full of war crimes. And the top levels of the administration just said, we hear you. Thank you for your opinion. We're going to keep going. And that's kind of what the campaign has done with anti-war voters. Anti-war voters arguably have more leverage over the campaign and the party than government officials have over the administration. So we'll see if the party does some kind of rethink based on the results. But the legacy, I think, that's being built here is one of deep disillusionment. I think the anti-war movement, many of its leaders made a really sincere, stronger than I would, frankly, effort to give Kamala Harris a lot of room to show them she wanted to engage. And you saw that for weeks and weeks. You saw it even after the DNC, where there was that huge disappointment that there wasn't a Palestinian American speaker. Leaders in the uncommitted movement of protest voters said, look, we could still endorse Kamala Harris, just give us a date when she might meet with some of our families. And the campaign wouldn't do that. So I think that betrayal is really deep, and it's really hard for folks in that community.
And that's The Take. At Al Jazeera Podcasts, we want to hear from listeners like you. So if you have a few minutes, go to aljazeera.com/survey and tell us about yourself. From things like how you listen to us to what kind of shows you want to listen to or topics you'd like us to cover. Again, that's aljazeera.com/survey. Looking forward to hearing from you.